There was a time when shame had a moral function. It wasn't merely about humiliation, it was the mirror that helped us measure whether our actions aligned with our values. To feel shame once meant you were still connected to conscience. It was proof that you hadn't gone entirely numb to right and wrong. But something radical has happened in our time. Shame has vanished, or worse, been mocked. We now live in an age where everything can be flaunted, where nothing deserves boundaries, and where exposure has become a form of validation. People once guarded their private flaws with humility, but now they broadcast them for likes, as if confession without transformation were a virtue. And I ask myself, if we can no longer feel shame, what keeps us human? The ancient philosophers taught that to lose shame is to lose the bridge between civilization and chaos. Think about it. Shame is what once stopped us from hurting others, from betraying trust, from crossing moral lines too easily. But we are living in an era where transgression has become entertainment and repentance has become optional. What happens to a society when there are no longer any boundaries that hurt to cross? We call this liberation, but might it secretly be collapse? We've confused shamelessness with confidence, and that's a deep philosophical mistake. Confidence demands self-mastery, shamelessness is self-abandonment. The confident person chooses authenticity within honor. The shameless person believes that anything can be justified if it gains attention. Social media, driven by reward algorithms, has turned moral restraint into weakness and exhibition into courage. It's no wonder people do everything for views. Humiliation becomes currency, scandal becomes marketing. It's not that humanity suddenly got more evil, we just found a new way to profit from vice. Nietzsche warned about the coming of an age where truth would be reduced to what is useful, and virtue would dissolve under the acid of spectacle. The age of no shame is that prophecy come to life, an empire of visibility, where we no longer ask, is this right? But will people notice me? Tell me, when did visibility replace virtue? When did confession stop being a moral act and become a content strategy?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Shame, in its healthiest sense, used to be our teacher. It whispered when pride went too far, when ego began to corrupt. But now we silence that whisper, calling it repression or old-fashioned guilt. We say, don't judge, but without judgment, how do we differentiate degradation from growth? You see, shame always had two sides: destructive shame, which imprisons, and constructive shame, which awakens conscience. The first kills, but the second redeems. The danger isn't that we have too much shame, it's that we've lost the ability to feel the right kind. Look around. Men boast of infidelity, women glorify manipulation, corporations parade greed, and society calls it branding. We confuse shamelessness with strength because we've forgotten that discipline used to be the highest form of self-respect. The person who cannot be ashamed of anything eventually becomes incapable of greatness. Why? Because greatness requires restraint. The artist disciplines perception, the warrior disciplines emotion, the philosopher disciplines speech. Freedom without discipline is decay. So what kind of freedom have we really achieved if it leaves us morally homeless? We've replaced ethical refinement with exposure culture, the belief that honesty means telling everything, even when nothing is learned from it. People now treat confession as catharsis, not as a doorway to transformation. At least I'm being real, they say, as if being real without being responsible were a virtue. But there's no glory in revealing wounds you refuse to heal. True honesty doesn't scream, it contemplates. Think if Socrates didn't confess to virtue-signaling crowds, he examined himself in silence. Real integrity happens when no one is watching, not when everyone's commenting. But in the age of no shame, existence itself is a performance, life a constant audition. The tragedy is that by turning confession into spectacle, we've made authenticity impossible. There is no inner life left to protect, no mystery to unfold. And without mystery, depth dies. How can we expect to love deeply or think profoundly when everything private has become public property? The real danger is that an unashamed society cannot evolve, it can only spiral. Shame, when properly felt, alerts us to moral imbalance. It's the mind's immune system. To abolish it in the name of self-expression is to kill the mechanism that makes introspection possible. What happens to a generation that celebrates exposure but forgets reflection? We become shallow vessels, loud but hollow, expressive but lost. When nothing is sacred, everything becomes trivial. The philosopher in me says this isn't just cultural, it's metaphysical. We've lost reverence for the interior. We no longer believe there's a higher standard beyond personal gratification. That's why shame vanished, it had nowhere left to anchor. And now the human soul drifts without compass or depth. Some call that progress, but I call it amnesia. We've forgotten the ancient truth that dignity is the foundation of meaning, and shame was its quiet guardian. So the real question is not, how do we get rid of shame? But how do we restore the kind of conscience that makes shame sacred again? Because maybe, just maybe, our salvation lies not in inventing new freedoms, but in remembering why we once protected our souls from erosion. If the first symptom of the age of no shame is moral numbness, the second is what thrives in its place, narcissism. When shame disappears, pride takes the throne. Pride isn't new, it's one of humanity's oldest temptations. From the Tower of Babel to today's towers of selfies, but something about this era feels fundamentally different. Our pride isn't rooted in dignity, it's rooted in performance. It's not pride in mastery or moral strength, it's pride in attention. We no longer strive to be good, we strive to look good. Every cause, every virtue, every act of kindness risks being swallowed by self-advertisement. You've seen it, I've done it, we all have virtue displayed like a trophy, activism that's self-referential, humility rehearsed for applause. Nietzsche wrote that vanity was the shadow of greatness, it follows the noble but consumes the weak. So what happens when our whole civilization starts chasing shadows? The tragedy is that pride has devoured conscience. We proclaim virtue loudly enough to mask the emptiness underneath. Think about it, has everything profound become branding? Do we still stand for something when we measure our worth in likes and moral outrage points? We once used shame to anchor our pride, to keep it tethered to moral responsibility. But now we've detached them and told ourselves that pride alone can guide us. That's why our culture wobbles between arrogance and fragility. Each person becomes a self-contained deity, my truth, my body, my purpose, as if the world were obligated to orbit around personal feelings. Pride without conscience breeds entitlement, and entitlement blinds us to the quiet beauty of humility, the kind that once kept the human heart sane. The proud person sees criticism as violence, boundaries as oppression, and accountability as insult. But you know what's ironic? You can't live freely while enslaved to your own image. Nietzsche warned that when people start worshiping the self, they end up mutilating it. The ego always eats itself in the end. The modern ego has become an idol crafted from filters, hashtags, and slogans. It's fragile, expensive to maintain, and utterly exhausting. Tell me this: when was the last time you met someone truly at peace, who was addicted to their own reflection? The rise of narcissism isn't accidental, it's systemic. The digital world is engineered to exploit our vanity because it knows vanity never sleeps. Every notification whispers you exist. It's the modern-day replacement for meaning. Our devices have become confessional booths where we seek absolution not from God or conscience, but from algorithms that bless us with engagement. The philosopher René Girard once said that human desire is imitative. We want what others seem to want. So when the system begins to glorify shamelessness, the spiral becomes inevitable. Pride becomes the new virtue, and humility the new sin. Humanity starts consuming itself through constant comparison. We think we're expressing individuality, but we're actually copying the same patterns of self-glorification. And the saddest part? This narcissistic culture rewards performance over sincerity. Real responsibility, doing what's right without recognition, becomes obsolete. Why repair what can be replaced by a new trend tomorrow? Have we become spectators of our own decay, clapping as the walls of depth collapse inward? And what happens to relationships in such a world? Real love, friendship, loyalty, they all require shame, not as punishment but as reverence. To feel shame before the one you love is to acknowledge that your actions can wound something sacred. But in the age of no shame, intimacy becomes transaction. People commodify their souls in exchange for validation. Vulnerability becomes strategy, and affection becomes leverage. It's not that we don't crave connection, we crave it so much that we simulate it constantly. Except simulation can't feed the spirit. Nietzsche might say this is what happens when people confuse emotional exhibition with emotional evolution. You don't become deeper by revealing more, you become deeper by revealing wisely. Without that wisdom, we exploit even our pain for sympathy points, and in doing so, deform ourselves. Before, pride was checked by conscience, now conscience is drowned by constant self-display. I often wonder, can we even feel intimacy anymore when everyone's performing sincerity in public? Yet, I don't believe Nietzsche would leave us hopeless. He'd say this era is not our end, it's our test. He would challenge us to reclaim the dignity of private excellence, to cultivate pride not as self-idolatry, but as artful self-respect. The only cure for toxic pride is earned pride, the kind that grows from discipline, truth-telling, and moral independence. Real confidence doesn't scream, it radiates through quiet integrity. The modern person must learn to rebuild conscience at the personal level, because no society that glorifies shamelessness will hand it to you. Pride is dangerous, yes, but when it's balanced by responsibility, it fuels human greatness. Nietzsche's call was not to eradicate ego, but to strengthen it through moral clarity until pride no longer feeds vanity, but virtue. The question is, will you let your pride control you, or will you refine it into mastery? The age of no shame doesn't just destroy us collectively, it tempts each of us individually. And the rebellion begins by saying, I will no longer perform. I will live truthfully, even if no one claps. To restore what has been lost in this age of no shame, we must first return to a place most people avoid: the interior. Reverence begins where noise ends. And yet, in our age, silence feels unbearable. We seek distractions not because we love entertainment, but because we fear reflection. As a philosopher, I've realized something terrifying. Most of us are not living our own lives, we are performing them. A life performed cannot be sacred, because its audience becomes its God. Reverence, the deep respect for existence itself, can only grow when we stop outsourcing validation. In older cultures, reverence was woven into everything: the way people spoke, the way they handled death, even the way they greeted the morning. Life was not taken for granted, it was honored. But now meaning collapses under the speed of gratification. We are too busy reacting to feel awe. Nietzsche, though misunderstood, deeply revered life not as comfort, but as a cosmic challenge. He wanted us to take existence personally, to look at living not as something happening to us, but as something entrusted to us. Reverence is that attitude. It's the recognition that being alive is a responsibility. Ask yourself, when was the last time you did something quietly noble, not for recognition, not for applause, but because it was right? Without reverence, there can be no dignity. Dignity doesn't come from approval. It comes from remembering that you are accountable to something higher than yourself. And here's the paradox. In a world obsessed with self-expression, we have forgotten the art of self-respect. We mistake loudness for authenticity, but the loudest people are often those who can't stand the sound of their own solitude. Reverence would remind us that true individuality isn't in shouting who you are, it's in embodying your principles when no one's watching. The philosopher Immanuel Kant called dignity that which has no price, what cannot be bought, sold, or performed. He argued that a person of dignity treats both self and others as ends, never as means. Can you imagine how radically healing that simple idea could be in our current culture of exploitation? Every relationship, every post, every decision could transform if guided by reverence, if we ask not what will they think of me, but what does this say about who I choose to be? Dignity is invisible but powerful. It radiates through restraint, sincerity, and compassion. You don't see it trending, but you feel it in the presence of those who still honor their word, their time, and their conscience. Relearning reverence also means redefining what it means to be human. For centuries, shame and reverence coexisted as our moral compass. One taught humility, the other taught significance. Without humility, reverence dies, because nothing seems greater than the self. Without reverence, humility decays into cowardice, because there is nothing sacred worth kneeling to. We need both again. Nietzsche warned that when society loses tragedy, it loses depth. We have perfected entertainment but forgotten ritual. We celebrate everything but sanctify nothing. And in that vacuum, the soul shrinks. Imagine if every person began to treat their body like a temple, their thoughts like prayers, their relationships like covenants. How different would this digital chaos feel? Reverence is rebellion in an era that monetizes blasphemy. To refuse to mock what is sacred, even when the mob demands it, that is strength. And to act kindly without broadcasting it, that is beauty. Reverence doesn't shout, it listens. It refuses to trivialize what touches eternity, love, truth, death, creation. Think about it. When was the last time you felt awe so intense that words seemed unworthy? That silence, that trembling, that's what the mind without shame has forgotten. But reverence isn't just spiritual, it's practical. When you hold the world as sacred, your behavior changes. You stop treating people as props. You stop consuming experiences and start living them fully. You apologize differently. You give rather than perform generosity. You become, in a sense, a philosopher in motion, someone who acts not from impulse, but from vision. The most radical thing any of us can do in this age of exposure is to reclaim mystery, to be a person who can hold beauty privately, to be someone capable of wonder, even when the feed goes dark. When reverence returns, empathy returns, because you begin to see others not as extensions of yourself, but as souls walking beside you through the same storm. That's the core of healing, not systems or hashtags, but individuals who quietly choose to be whole again. Nietzsche imagined the Übermensch not as a superhuman ego, but as someone who could endure chaos and still choose meaning. Maybe our version of that today isn't about dominating, but about dignifying, holding fast to depth in a shallow time. Could it be that the most heroic act now is not rebellion itself, but reverence done in secret? So here we stand, in a world that forgot how to blush, a civilization that confuses exposure with evolution. But I don't think we've lost everything. The very fact that shame feels distant tells me something in us still remembers it. The ache we feel when surrounded by artifice, the exhaustion after too much performance, these are signs of conscience, not collapse. Nietzsche said the task of humanity was to give birth to dancing stars, to turn suffering and confusion into creative power. That's still within us. We can't fix the world overnight, but we can begin with one decision: to live by inner law again, to rediscover honor, to make restraint radiant, to build humility into strength. Imagine if truth and beauty became fashionable again, if depth regained its gravity. The age of no shame doesn't end with noise. It ends when enough of us choose silence, awe, and authenticity over humiliation disguised as freedom. So I'll leave you with a question only you can answer. When the world is built to make you shameless, will you have the courage to live with reverence, even if the crowd calls it weakness? Because maybe dignity isn't what the world gives you. Maybe it's what you refuse to surrender.